And welcome back to Meeting of the Minds. Today I'm here with the great Dr. Kevin Vost. Excited to have him. I read one of his books, one of his many books, 1 Minute Aquinas. He is a psychologist. He is a Thomist. He is a powerlifter. He is great at everything that I want to be great at, and I'm super excited to have him on. How's it going?
It's going great, Gene, and I'll say a couple things. But that 1 Minute Aquinas, that one's coming out in Italian in the fall. So really thrilled about that one, a translation there, yeah. I'll also say, too, I've recently looked up some of your materials, and I'm really excited about what you're doing, the Catholic world and the athletic world. So this should be a fun talk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, real excited. So I guess the first thing that I think about now, so I grew up Catholic, had a public school education, got my master's degree in exercise science, sports psychology, another master's in clinical psychology. I was going for my doctorate in clinical psych. That didn't wind up working out. That's why I got the second master's degree. But as I learned more about the faith 5 years ago, starting to read about Aquinas, I almost feel like I need to reintegrate the material that I learned into the framework of Catholicism. How do I make sense of psychology and all that I've learned? What do I keep? What do I get rid of? What are some of your thoughts? It's a little bit of like an existential crisis here.
Sure. Well, I grew up Catholic myself, just for a little background. I did go through Catholic schools, but I'm not sure about either the quality of my catechesis or how much I was paying attention. But I read some kind of the wrong philosophers in my late teens, spent about 25 years as an atheist, not a person who spoke out against the church, but a person who just thought, well, I can't believe, read St. Thomas Aquinas myself for the first time in the year 2004. And next thing I knew, I was back to Christ, back to the church, and have been ever since. But in terms of psychology, yeah, in the meanwhile there, I got a bachelor's degree in psychology. I love philosophy. And for me, psychology was kind of my second choice because the schools here in town didn't have a philosophy major. I was too much of a homebody. So there's a lot of overlap. I'll do psychology, but it really worked out pretty well. Then later I got a master's in general psychology, where I focused on cognitive psychology, our thinking processes and memory and so on, and also developmental psychology. I did some part-time college teaching, mostly developmental courses, adolescence and lifespan, and also psychology of aging and so on. Well, it worked out for me that in my early 30s, I was able to go back and get a doctorate in clinical psychology, because being a state employee I'm in central Illinois, Springfield, Illinois. The state invited a school from up in Chicago to come and give courses here at our University of Illinois campus on weekends, so full-time employees could pursue a clinical doctorate. So I was able to do that, working full-time until my last year of dissertation and internship at our local medical school. So it really worked out all right. But I will say, to answer your question now, integrating psychology in St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the things that drew me back to the church was the second part of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, where he goes into great depth the nature of man, of humanity, what it is to be a human person, what fulfills us, what makes us happy. He goes so much into virtues as virtues of being perfections of the different powers God gave us. He even has his own, cognitive psychology. He borrowed much of it from Aristotle, but how we perceive and remember and imagine and so on. So I was just wowed by how Thomas, to me, was like the ultimate psychologist. He kind of he picked out the best of what came before him and refined it. So for me, also in my psychology, in my clinical background, I focus mostly on cognitive therapies. Albert Ellis, rational emotive behavior therapy, Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy. A lot of that came from the Stoic philosophers. And I found out that Thomas himself was well versed in these Stoic philosophers who value so much, the way we perceive the world, our judgments and decisions, whether they're accurate or not, will it impact our emotions, in our actions and so on. So even there, I found Thomas just this great summary, this wealth of information that I think is very, very consistent with some of the best ideas in our modern methods of therapy.
Excellent. Yeah, I've heard different people make sense of it different ways. I think it was in C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity, where he spoke about that psychology is giving us the improving our what do you say, the hardwire. Forget how he said it. Basically, making the stuff better to make moral decisions. It's all geared towards moral decision making. So it's the raw materials, improving the raw materials to make moral decisions. he spoke about that. I read Father Timothy Gallagher's book on discernment of spirits, St. Ignatius Exercises, and he spoke about spiritual and non-spiritual consolation and desolation, and saying how non-spiritual desolation could be a springboard to spiritual desolation, and
Yes.
vice versa with consolation. So I was trying to make sense of it like that. And then I also listened to Father Ripperger, watched a lot of his materials. He wrote this big book on, what is it, Introduction to Mental Health. I'm sure you've seen this before. I wonder what you're, let's see if you can see that.
Actually, I'm familiar with the Father. I've not read them, and I'll have to put that one on my list.
Huge book.
It is huge.
But he said something that kind of jarred me, saying that with a lot of psychology, unfortunately, because they're not recognizing the soul and the impact of the soul, you can't have a proper understanding of man, and therefore you can't basically make comments about man. And I'm thinking, I know I'm going on a little while here, but I thought about the cognitive distortions that could help people still, the social psychology tendencies, conformity, diffusion of responsibility. I'm like, I know that's good stuff. Maybe I just throw out like the Freud and the Jung. How do you make sense of all this? Because my head was spinning. Did I waste all my time in psychology? I don't think so.
Yeah, no, I don't think so either. I'm definitely going to get that book. That looks very intriguing and very, very deep analysis, I'm sure. And my perspective on it is, much of what I learned in psychology, I think, has been good, but it's been even fulfilled in our Catholic teaching.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, to know about the psyche, the mind, it's good to understand how it works, but it's more than that. We're a soul. We have an intellectual soul in the Catholic tradition, which our souls incorporate those vegetative functions of plants and animals, growth and reproduction, and so on. We share the animal, sensitive capacities of our five senses and ability to move about, and so on. But those uniquely human aspects of the intellectual soul, of our capacity to understand things, to think at a conceptual level, to think in terms of universals, to use language and so forth, makes us so totally unique among all species on Earth, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. So for me, there's a lot of partial truths there in secular psychology. They just don't have the big picture. They don't put it all together. There's lots of nice little tools, but they don't have the whole package that we get, through our wonderful Catholic tradition. So another example there, I wrote a book a few years back called The Porch and the Cross, Ancient Stoic Wisdom for Modern Christian Thinking. And again, I looked at them partly as precursors of modern cognitive psychotherapy. So I highlighted some very good ideas they have. And here's kind of the way I summed up. Why should we study these Stoic principles or these cognitive therapy principles? I say, well, here's one reason. Christ told us we need to love God with all we are, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So, the great commandment, the second commandment there. So I say it can be hard to do that. It can be hard to focus ourselves on God and on treating our neighbors the right way, even treating ourselves the right way, if we're always, envious of people, or if we're needlessly sad or depressed, or if we're anxious. So some of these methods of Stoicism, some of these methods of modern psychology, can be tools to help keep that in check so we can better put our focus where it really needs to be.
Yeah, excellent. Really good stuff. And I mean, I think about my brother's a seminarian, my youngest brother, and he had to learn philosophy before he learned theology there. Yeah. So I think about, okay, there's theology, there's philosophy, there's psychology. What would be your ideal order if you were designing a curriculum for how people should understand and just conceptualize this the right way without having to go back and forth, which of course there's always going to be some element of. How would you recommend that they learn? What would be the order?
Yeah, of those basic disciplines, that's a real good question. And let me take one approach. There's many possible approaches. I don't necessarily have the right one, but you held up the book, The 1 Minute Aquinas,
right?
And that is a summary of his Summa Theologica. The Summa itself is 1.5 million words, over 3,000 pages, just gigantic. I tried to get some of the highlights in 300 pages or so. And the way Thomas lays it out, he starts, part one is about God. I mean, he starts his famous proofs of God, the attributes of God, all this deep philosophical, logical reasoning based on our senses. Then he moves into the great mysteries of the Trinity, how creation flows from God. In the second part, he focuses on man and humanity, what it is to be a person, what will bring us happiness, a limited happiness on earth, complete happiness in heaven. And then the third part of that, that's where Thomas zooms in on Christ, God made man, Christ, the church, the sacraments he gave us. And it's been described as a big circle. Everything starts from God, It flows out to man, but for us to return to God, we do it through Christ, the mediator. It's like this glorious circle here. Well, when I wrote the book, The 1 Minute Aquinas, my editor made a suggestion, which I really liked once I thought about it. He suggested that we start with that material from the second part first. And here's the reason why. It's about a human nature, and we're all humans. Right. So we can easily read that. It's a more psychological too, with philosophical and theological aspects also, of course. But just kind of starting with what we can know and understand most easily and intuitively. So in a certain sense, that presentation, Thomas, I guess you could kind of say, started with psychology. Then it moved into philosophy in the second part. But we just started with psychology, then moved into the more abstract topics. So, but I guess one way for a person kind of new to the topic to kind of see how they all interweave would be, my recommendation would be, pick up, simple books that are true to Thomas Aquinas, that summarize his thinking. Because I think he just so deftly weaves them all together in a way that really makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. And to give you a plug for the book, this was an excellent book, super easy to understand. I love the charts. I'm a big charts guy, so anytime I take pictures of these things. I have like what I call a book of everything, where I put all my favorite charts in there. A lot of the psychology charts we've seen over the years from my classes. Yes. I love that. This was an excellent book, super easy to understand. I bought your book, The 7 Deadly Sins. I have had to memorize the Latin Mass. I mean, my plan was really to get all of them at once, but I don't want my wife to see me come with. I always have Catholic books coming in, so.
Yeah, I know how that is.
No, that's excellent. I guess I think, and I like how you do that. You start with kind of like human nature, because you're hooking the reader in, you're relating specifically to them, and then you could pull them into the world of Aquinas. We do a similar thing with our business, Winning Mindset. I've seen a lot of sports psychologists work with teams, and unfortunately they turn wine into water, because they start with more of, it seems logical to start with goal setting with the team, or a visualization sequence where everyone lays down, you cut the lights, and you walk them through it. Unfortunately, athletes are so much more tangible, like kinesthetic learners, that if it's not directly relating to them, you're already almost going in at a disadvantage, because, why do we need this? I don't have problems, and all that nonsense. So we come in right away talking about, we know you're giving good opponents too much respect. You're competing better in practice than a competition. You're a slow starter. You're focusing too much on the records, the seedings, and the predictions. Or in a sport like football or baseball, you're focusing on your stats. And right away, boom, we hook them. And then we could pull them into the goal setting and the visualization. So it's relating right away, as opposed to possibly turning them off.
Well, that's excellent. I love the sounds of that approach, and make it real to them, to speak to where they are at that point in time. And that, for this particular book, I remember my editor was very helpful there. He also, the way we started out, I have a section, who's the smartest man in the world, and I'm giving different candidates and telling why Thomas is so smart, not only smart, but wise. But that came from this idea where the editor said, imagine you've got a junior high gymnasium full of junior high kids, and you've got 45 minutes where they're locked in there with you. How are you going to get them interested in St. Thomas Aquinas, right? So that's, speak to something that might intrigue them, that relates to where they are, So I think, your approach with athletes seems to be the same thing. Give something practical, something real, and then work your way into the deeper underlying principles that will make it even more real, more practical in the long run.
Yeah. And starting with some of your videos where you're just absolutely crushing heavyweight, now the kids are interested. Now they want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I will say that's one thing since these lockdowns. I didn't used to post videos of my weightlifting. I've always been a gym person, for 40 some years. In fact, my wife, I was her weightlifting instructor back in 1983. It's how we met. But in recent months, I've kind of built up a home gym, and what the heck, I'm lifting by myself or sometimes with my son. So I'll post those videos, to maybe see people see what I'm doing, because I'd written about weightlifting in the book Fit for Eternal Life, so they can see, 15 years later, I'm still trying to apply it. So, and kind of a goal setting too. I'm trying to work back to a 500-pound deadlift. It'd be the first time I've done it in 20 years. So, nice. Trying to psych up for that.
Excellent. Oh, that's great stuff. A couple practical questions for you. The DSM. Now we're on the DSM-5. Mm-hmm. What do I make of that as a Catholic now? Are there DSM versions, I know they always go by the most updated version, but is there a version that you believe is closest to reality? What do I make of that?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I'm trying to think. I went through school in my doctoral program in the 1990s. Gosh, what were we? DSM 3R, or maybe we'd hit 4. Maybe we'd hit 4 at that time. And the problem there, and I've got a 5. When I wrote a book on loneliness a few years ago, I wanted to make sure I was very up to date. But the problem has been gone on for a long time. Since like the 1970s, when so many of these diagnoses became a matter of vote, a majority decision. Diagnoses related to sexuality are probably the prime example here. So I can't think of really many specifics there. If you're going to diagnose people today, if you're a clinician, they're expected to use the most recent up-to-date manuals. But so I won't have too much in specific to say about the DSM-5. I've not gone over it in great detail, but that's just my main concern, though, is that over recent decades, even the psychiatric manuals have been adapted to politics and to secular thinking that comes and goes and kind of changes depending on what's popular. And many people may not realize that because they think of medicine as science, something that's fixed and factual, just like it speaks, science says. Well, even in the sciences, especially the social sciences, there's a lot of room there for speculation and opinion and politics.
Right. And of course, we want to walk with everyone. We want to be there for them and yes, be sensitive to their needs and their struggles. But now, of course, you see a lot of things with homosexuality, transgenderism, these kind of difficult topics where it's now like kind of normalizing it as opposed to saying, well, we need to help them. How do we reconcile that as Catholics? I mean, I'm not working with anyone clinically or anything, but I just think about how would a psychologist approach that to be first and foremost faithful to the Catholic Church, and then secondly, to do their job to the best of their ability.
Yeah, that's a good and a tough question, Gene. I will say I'm not in clinical practice either. So I guess in a way I'm lucky, fortunate, blessed that I don't have to deal with that in a real life situation like so many practicing therapists would. There, I guess, kind of the main idea I'd want to get across is that fundamental Catholic idea that, while we are called to hate sins, specific behaviors, we're always called to love those sinners. So if a person had a person in their therapy practice who had sexual practices that are contrary to the teaching of the church, I would suppose you would never want to do anything to directly encourage those particular behaviors. But at the same time, you want to try to help that person, to show them the same kind of love and respect that you would for any client whatsoever. That you're genuinely going to try to help them in things that are there in their best interest, without endorsing or enabling behaviors that you don't condone based on faith and or reason.
Right. And I guess it just gets tricky because I remember when I was learning, when I was studying clinical, it was more like the Rogerian empty chair, reflect back what they're saying, yeah, and then kind of let them find their answers. Here's what was kind of problematic to me as a Catholic, even before I was deep into my faith, just having a sense that there are certain principles that you need to follow. If you were playing a piano, you can't just bang the piano and say, well, figure it out for yourself. If I'm wrestling or if I'm weightlifting, there's a certain way that you need, there are mechanics, there is technique that you must conform to. And I always thought that maybe it's a little bit dangerous because in no other area are we allowing people to figure it out on their own completely. We never start with letting them figure it out on their own. It starts with, these are the principles, teaching you how to think. And that's what I've kind of said with our business, with Winning Mindset. Step one is teaching you how to think. What are the kind of the common roadblocks, and then helping you find your way. But it has to be built on those principles. What are your thoughts with that?
Oh, I'm right with you there. When I was coming through school first in the 1980s, yeah, the Rogerian type, unconditional acceptance and all was very, very popular. The Freudian, where the
Ellis too, unconditional acceptance. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ellis did write about unconditional acceptance. That is true. And then we had the Freudians, letting people kind of free associate without much direct interaction. And with Ellis, Ellis, I think, is a very unique character because there's so much bad and so much good. He got some things very, very wrong and some things very, very right also. But I do remember one thing that Ellis said when he was doing that kind of therapy, just reflecting and so forth. He said, at times I felt I should, get that person up off the couch and sit them across from me in a chair and talk to them, which is what he did. When he started rationally emotive therapy, then there were later related cognitive therapies. That was the idea. In a sense, they were teaching proper principles of thought, thinking how to judge things accurately in your world, not to have an unnecessarily pessimistic viewpoint or overly optimistic viewpoint, to see things as they really are, to realize that you do have some measure of control over your emotions that you may not realize you have. So Ellis did things like, he gave these like irrational ideas, common ideas he saw that people have that upset themselves. I think number one was, the idea that everyone must love me and accept me, or I'm going to be miserable if I'm not, And I think he's right there. Now, where he went wrong was he believed that organized religions like Christianity endorsed that idea, right? But, Christ told us, blessed are we when we're going to be persecuted. He says, we're to love other people. There's no guarantee they're going to love us. So I think Ellis was right on the idea that people tend to think this way and it can disturb us. He was wrong on the idea that Christianity endorses this. But I think one of the reasons I've always favored the cognitive therapies is that, in their better elements, they are kind of like an instrumentality for clear, accurate thinking. They have a lot of applications or relationship just to logical reasoning, So your conclusions are actually based on evidence, so they follow logically, So your emotions are based on reality. So that's always been my preferred approach to psychology, to kind of help people think right, which is in a way, it coincides with the Catholic Thomistic idea of virtue. Thomas Aquinas calls the moral virtues, bringing your actions and your feelings and passions in line with right reason. So in a sense, some of the best of these cognitive therapies, that's what they're trying to do, trying to bring our emotions and our actions, make them reasonable.
Yeah. And my professor in college, he was a phenomenologist, and he was very big with saying he made a distinction between the reality with an uppercase R versus a lowercase r. And you could even make a further distinction that he's talking about the person's subjective reality, not necessarily reality as it is. So he was saying when a client comes in, you don't want to slam them over the head right away with the capital R. You want to find out what makes sense. In what world does this behavior make sense? And then you would lead them to the reality as it is. So
yes.
Does that make sense?
It sure does. It reminds me, there's a statement in one of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics, writing, where he says, tell yourself every morning, today I'm going to meet the nosy person, the busybody. He goes on and on, the unneighborly person. But then he goes on to say, but I must remind myself that, in a sense, this all makes sense to them. There's a reason they're doing this, and in their mindset, their small r, that's their reality. So you're not going to necessarily blame them. You're not going to let them upset you unduly. But if you get a chance, you're going to try to reason with them. And if the position of a therapist, in a sense, that's what they're there for. So, I definitely believe that approach. See where the person's coming from. See how what we would consider a distorted view of reality, but see how it makes sense to them within the framework they're coming from.
Right. And it just seems that because there are all seeds, like you said, there's seeds of truth. What is it? Semina verba, or the seeds of the word, anywhere you look. But I guess I started with Ellis. I started with Rogers, like the psychology world. And then I now had to work backwards. And I'm thinking maybe it would have just been better if I read, like, again, a book like yours about Aquinas, get the framework down. And then once I'm solid in the faith, then enter into that. Are there any schools that you know of that do that? Any Catholic schools that give a more integrated approach if someone were going into psychology?
Well, I've not had any dealings with that. I just remember there was an institute for psychological science, possibly out on the East Coast. They changed their names. I don't really have any affiliation with them, so I can't say for certain on that one. Because at this point, I worked in the disability evaluation field for most of my life, for 32 years, doing mental and physical disability cases. Then went back to school, got my degree, and I did college teaching after that, on a part-time basis for many, many years. But I wasn't deeply involved in clinical practice, and I was never full-time academic. So unfortunately don't have a lot of those ties there. I can't guide you for sure in that regard.
All right. That would just be a good thing, I guess, for both of us to keep our eyes open for it, because I always think my thought process is always, how can I, if, okay, so I have a son who's 14 months. I have another one coming in 6 weeks. My
Uh-huh.
mentality, my mentality, my whole life was, if I was working with someone or if I was training my kids, how would I want them to receive the material with minimal wasted time or effort? So that's where I think, again, your materials are just excellent for laying
Yeah.
that solid foundation.
Well, exactly. I'm with you too. So one other thing, Gene, I was always into weightlifting things, but also somewhat of a bit of a bookworm. So sometimes too, I go through, my own mind. Had got a master's degree and a doctorate, but I think most of what I know and most of what I write about right now, what percentage of that originally came through school and what percentage came through my own study and reading, and the greatly vast majority, came from self-study.
Yeah.
But hopefully in school, it's going to help you develop the abilities or the interests and maybe not kill them off to do that. But yeah, I mean, formal their programs are definitely excellent. And if a person's not a critical thinker, if they're not thinking on their own, they can, of course, so easily be swayed into that particular thought pattern, whatever school they're going to. I mean, I think we're seeing that around the nation today in a very, very big way. But I also value that idea of self-learning. Well, I happen to be in Springfield, Illinois, and we're the town of Abraham Lincoln. And he's one of the famous examples of a person who is largely an autodidact, who taught himself so much, which is, of course, something too that we can ideally will continue to do throughout our lifespan.
Yeah, it's super frustrating when I think about it, because a lot of times it's a lot of time spent unlearning, and you think of all the time and all the money that went into it, that we basically were indoctrinated to think like Freemasons. Um, Science, a lot of it was taught from a certain perspective to push a certain agenda away from the church. The catechesis was weak. We had a lot of watered down, sadly, Vatican II types of, as opposed to traditional Catholicism that we were basically taught. History, and we were taught about how the church was evil. The Middle Ages were just this dark age and everything, when in fact this was the height of Christendom and the great Catholic monarchs and how great that was, as opposed to the Enlightenment, French Revolution, Masonic principles that we've been essentially brainwashed with. So it's difficult then working backwards.
Yeah, it sure is. And I can so relate to what you mean. I mean, I valued a lot what I got from my Catholic education. I had grade school with Dominican sisters and high school with these Viatorian priests and brothers. But again, I went through school in the 60s and 70s, right post Vatican II era. And to me, again, unless I wasn't paying attention, and I was a pretty good student in other subjects, I think I was, but I'll learn almost nothing of substance. So when I was in my late teens, and I come across these atheist philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Ayn Rand, and the psychologist Albert Ellis, I was just ripe for the picking.
Right.
They gave arguments. Oh, the idea of God is self-contradictory, or it's unnecessary, or you have to then answer who made God. All these ideas, nothing in my schooling had equipped me to deal with any of those. And so it took me 25 years before I came across all those answers that were sitting there in Thomas Aquinas for over 700 years, and most of which, he took or adapted from people, church fathers and philosophers who lived long before he did. But despite, no, actually I had 13 years of Catholic education. One of my college years was in a Catholic school. Despite 13 years of Catholic education, I had no training in any of that.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's very frustrating. And I think, and then even one of the things I was interested in with personality psychology, so we learned about the MMPI, right? The big five. One of the things that was real interesting to me was that the Myers and Briggs. I know it's very black and white, but at the same time, it seemed like my personality fit me so well. My dad's hit his so well, so I was just interested in that. So I bought the David Keirsey book, who talks about those different personality types, and he claims that it's from a foundation of the choleric, the sanguine, and those kind of. That's Aristotle. No, that's Plato. Right, Plato's Republic. So, and then I look at Aquinas and I look at the appetites and I think, well, okay, as a Catholic, how should I view this? Do I scrap the Myers? Because again, there is usefulness in everything, right? You could find some usefulness in it, but how do I conceptualize it? Should if I started, I suppose, start with Aquinas and then look at the other things as little ancillary tools?
Yeah, I would, personally, for deepest understanding of psychology, yeah, I would dig into Thomas, but then also look at those other things and find the commonalities. Sometimes they're going to be preaching ideas that Thomas wrote about, 700, 800 years ago, and the other Catholic thinkers long before. Yeah, just be enlightened to look at it, look at the pros and the cons. Like you said, the seeds of truth there. I don't recall in the theoretical background so much of the Myers-Briggs to know if I'd say I disagree with this particular point or that. But I will say some of those personality tests can be very, very telling and useful. I remember I took one going through school. I think it might have been the 16 PF. And then it gave predictions of like what professions are going to be ideal for you. And I remember some of the highest scores I got in that thing were psychologist. Another was a rehabilitation counselor, and I worked in the disability evaluation field for 30 some years. It had me high for things like priest, and it had me lowest, I remember, in as an accountant. And no offense to accountants, but the only college course I couldn't stand. And it said I should not be a gas station manager also. But those things are just really, there are some truths, those personality tests, tend to pick up. And there's nothing, mystical about it. There's nothing contrary to church teaching about the fundamental idea that there are commonalities of personality out there. So I think that there are some helpful things there. And if I can digress just a little bit, Gene.
Sure.
Okay, one of the things I love about Thomas, he writes about what we all of us share in common as human beings. The broadest fundamental there, the brotherhood of man, where no matter what race you're on, no matter what continent you're on, no matter what color skin you have, we have something in common. We are the beings with the intellectual soul. We are all the beings and the only beings on earth made in the image and likeness of God. So he really deeply understands, here's what we all share in common. Thomas is also so very, very aware of the individual differences. God has given different of us, different capacities, different raw capacities and gifts and interest, and how wonderful. That's what makes the world go around. There are people who do things for a living that I wouldn't do for all the money in the world, and some of the things I do, I'm sure, writing a book, I hear so many people say, how can you possibly ever even want to do that, But Thomas understands that. But I think one of our problems today is we get stuck in the middle. There's so much now that focuses not the universally human, not the individual differences, but group think. How we fit in a particular race, a particular nation, a particular, political party. So I think an understanding of Thomas can really help us grasp that fact that just because you're a particular color or come from a particular nation, you still share things in common with everybody. And even within your group, there are very important, significant individual differences because each of us is an individual person that God crafted that way, and that matters.
Absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense, and it's so important now that people see it in the context, just like you're saying there, because it's a lot of people are just very confused about that, the different racial groups, different, but yet we're individuals. So how are we connected to everyone? What is a valid way to view our connection with other people, and what is an invalid way to view that? And Aquinas would absolutely help with that.
Yeah, he sure does. Even at the national level, he talks about the virtue of piety and how that relates. One aspect came from Latin that meant a patriotism, which is a proper respect for your particular country. He says how it means like piety is regards to honoring your father and your mother, and we know nations are typically called fatherlands, motherlands. So there's an importance there. We can have a proper understanding of these different relationships and group identities that do make a difference. That they're a positive thing, But being able to value our own without that meaning we must disvalue others.
Right. Very, very important. Very important. Interesting thing I was looking at with different forms of therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, Marsha Linehan. So I studied about her, and I was reading about some of the different things she incorporates. She was the first therapist that I saw that on her overall theory included prayer, exercise. It looked like it was a more holistic approach, and DBT helping having the highest success rate, I believe, with borderline personality disorder, which is, I think, the highest suicide rate, which is crazy. Well, I learned about her back in 2008 or 2009, 2010. Then in 2015, I started studying the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And some of the points that he makes was act the opposite way that you feel. And he was speaking about consolation and desolation. I said, this seems similar to dialectical behavioral therapy. I said, I wonder if Dr. Linehan is familiar with St. Ignatius. So I Googled her, and on Wikipedia it said she went to Loyola University.
Ah, fascinating.
And it actually said that she came up with the epiphany for dialectical behavioral therapy while she was praying in a chapel. And she was a devout Catholic her whole life. And I said, wow, that's very interesting. So I've been trying to reach out to her to ask her questions about that. But as you'd imagine, she's a difficult person to get a hold of. So I thought about that, dialectical behavioral therapy, and how successful it is helping people with borderline. Then I thought about Alcoholics Anonymous, these 12-step programs, which talk about surrender, a higher power.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, wow. And that helps people pull them out of that whole mess of addictions. And I'm starting to see how these therapies, in that their Catholic elements, are what's saving people. Have you ever thought about that, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with her particular system, but yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, there's the writing, I guess it's in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, almost any wonderful, idea that relates to human functioning, and human thriving, chances are in some form there's a kernel out there that's been around for thousands of years, and chances are it's been picked up on and built upon within the Catholic tradition, right? So I just finished rereading a book that I like to read every so many years by a philosopher named Pierre Hadot called Philosophy is a Way of Life. And in some of his chapters, he talks about the concept of the spiritual exercise as it was practiced by ancient philosophers like Stoics and Epicureans and others, and then also how the similar techniques were used by the early church fathers and Clement of Alexandria, and then most famously in the kind of the capstone there in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. So yeah, there's an incredible confluence there, and I think without knowing your system in depth, yeah, well, one thing, if it can have success with patients who've been diagnosed as borderline personality, there's got to be something to it, just sadly, that particular condition seems so deeply ingrained. So that tells you something of its practical value right there. But then it just gives you an indication that it probably does have some very deep, the ability to reach deep within that person, deep within the soul. So I do imagine those spiritual elements are going where just purely rational, purely secular methods aren't going to be able to dig that deep.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. That's why that again, that understanding of the faith. A part of me wonders if we're really well versed with the faith and trying to live the faith, it would seem like things like anxiety and depression would be shooting way down. I mean, of course, there's neurological, physiological elements to it. Of course, we'll still have stressors, and natural personalities deal with those stressors differently. But I would just think that if you started, I hate to say Catholic mindset, because that's just called being sane and living in the real world.
Right. That's right.
But if we had that, I would think that a lot of mental illnesses would go way down.
Yeah, I think so too. And just from my own training in psychology, I always go back to Ellis, and I think how he was an atheist, or sometimes he said he's an agnostic, but he said he was like 99.9999999% sure, that God wasn't there. But he wrote Disparagingly of Religion. But I do remember that later in his life, there was the research studies out there showing that people who really had an intrinsic religion, a religious faith, a Christian faith that meant a lot to them, did actually tend to score higher in measures of mental health. So I agree with that. And I think if people, had a fuller embrace of the Catholic faith, I would agree that there's going to be a tendency to have less diagnosable mental illness, or if it's there, it's going to be less likely to be as severe or debilitating. And again, as you said, this doesn't discard the fact that some people may indeed, be more biologically prone. We think of the, diathesis of stress models. Different people have a, greater likelihood to develop a certain disorder throughout their lifestyle. But the different coping mechanisms you learn, maybe the spiritual strengths you build up, may be more likely to keep you below that threshold where that disorder doesn't pop up, or if it has, bring it down under threshold. So again, I would say, like, if there are any listeners who are struggling with severe anxiety or depression, that's not a time to say, oh, I'm not a good Catholic.
Right.
But it is a time to say, well, maybe though, if I embrace my faith even further, prayed to God for his assistance, maybe it'll give me even more strength than I get from it now.
Yeah, that's true and very interesting. Another thing that I think about, we tell our athletes about goal setting. We say your purpose is more important than your goal. Your purpose is what's going to drive you. And the purpose is not just success or making a lot of money or fame. Those are means to the ends of happiness, beatitude, right? We know that.
Yes,
So we
yes.
tell people to make it very simple and concrete. Your purpose is more important than your goal. You need to know your purpose. Now, knowing what I know, now it almost seems like that's not the way of putting it. Now I'm dealing with mostly secular, non-Catholic, or maybe some of them are Catholic, but they're all different faiths. I'm having trouble now saying to people your purpose, because if there is an objective purpose that's external to me, I'm leading you down the wrong road now, ethically and morally, because I'm telling you, you make your purpose. What do I do with that?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Well, here again, my thoughts go back to Thomas and what's universal, and you hit on it yourself. Ultimately, we are striving for happiness, because anything else, wealth, pleasure, power, sports, we're doing it because we think they're going to make us happy. But we know through our faith that, as Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they rest in thee, till they rest in God. So we know there's actually is an external, an objective purpose there. Which we're never going to be fulfilled unless we align our lives with God, in God's will. So dealing that with secular people, again, I don't do therapy, but this idea that happiness is the ultimate end, even on an earthly level. Aristotle writes about that extensively. That so even people who may not embrace a faith maybe start with this idea that in some sense happiness is the ultimate goal. Whatever else you're doing, you're trying to serve happiness. But then to know what actual real happiness is, what will make you happy, then you really do have to understand what is the nature of humanity. What are the powers that God gave us? Why are we here? Then that almost inevitably leads us deeper into philosophical and theological issues if the people are willing to go there.
Right. And it just seems like if we're looking at man as spirit, soul, and body, which he is, if we're not addressing that, we're only taking them to a certain level of healing. We're not, I'm always thinking in terms of maximize the potential. How do you maximize the potential? And I've concluded it's just impossible to do that if we don't talk about the Catholic faith. And I mean, the traditional teachings of the Catholic faith, it's impossible, because kind of like the New Age and psychology is, you need to have a purpose. Great. Having a purpose is far better than not having a purpose. Excellent. But we're missing a level that if there is an external purpose, an objective purpose that's external to me, then I'm not really bringing you all the way. In fact, you might come up with a purpose that's contrary to the purpose, and now we're going in the opposite direction. It's tough.
Well, that's so right. Yeah, with all the relativism today, that reminds me of a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. He says, this is my way, what is your way? There is no the way. This idea that everybody's purpose but what if that person's purpose is direct conflict to others? What if it doesn't respect other people's rights and so on? So there I had to say, I went through that mindset for a couple decades myself, that Nietzschean mindset, until St. Thomas reminded me that Christ told us that there is a way, and he is the way and the truth of the life. So ultimately that is where we need to go, and if we do that, if we're embracing that true way, then there we're going to have that, that ultimate fulfillment of our desire, that true happiness. And I think too, I don't know, maybe in the popular mind too, some people think that if you are embracing God as your ultimate happiness, that means you're giving up everything else, and I think not necessarily, that God also wants us to be, happy on earth if we achieve the things that we have in a virtuous manner. So God is just not either am I going to have a pleasureful life, or am I going to have a life devoted to God? It's kind of a false dichotomy. We can devote our life to God and seeking that ultimate happiness and live very fulfilled, happy lives on earth, still full of joy and humor and everything else, but again, aimed at that higher, that ultimate purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. Now, philosophy question, and this isn't something I'm very familiar with, but I heard Dr. Peter Kraft speak about. He said that not Aquinas. He said Aristotle is 90% Plato. Now I know Plato is Aristotle's teacher, and then when he spoke about this on the Matt Fradd show, Matt Fradd said, "Well, where are the forms?" Like, and he was asking, he was kind of confused with that. So, any thoughts on that, even if it's not a direct answer?
Sure, sure. And I will say, I'm much more well versed in Aristotle, in books about Aristotle, than Plato. Though, I have a high respect for Plato because it's also from him that we know Socrates. Not only him, Xenophon and some others, but primarily there. But I'll tell you honestly, here's one of my opinions. There's also a famous quote. It might have been from Mortimer Adler, the American. You're familiar with him?
Yep.
Great books, man. Born Jewish, called himself a pagan most of his life. Later in life, he became an Episcopalian. In his 90s, he died Catholic, though he always called himself a Thomist. But here's what his line was. Or this might have been, he might have been quoting somebody else, maybe Whitehead. But they said that, something like Plato asked all the big questions and Aristotle answered them. And I must say, that's more my way of thinking. I respect Plato, but I enjoy that precision in Aristotle that I see coming through in Aquinas. And that's not to say Aristotle didn't make mistakes by any means. We know there's plenty of factual mistakes in his writing, but in terms of the main philosophical ideas, certainly he learned from Plato, and there's definitely significant areas of overlap for sure. And I'm sure that Dr. Craif knows Plato far, far deeper than I do. But in my own reading and preference, I really find Aristotle of incredible practicality. And I'll give you one example. I wrote a book called The Four Friendships on different philosophers and theologians' theories of friendship. Aristotle, Cicero, St. Aelred of Rievaulx, and St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's some discourses in Plato that talk about friendships, and Socrates is there. And it's all a matter of questions. And to me, you're kind of spinning around and never really getting definitive answers. In Aristotle's books 8 and 9 of his Nicomachean Ethics, I think there's all kinds of very useful answers there about what friendship is. So just personally, I could personally relate to Aristotle and get much more out of him in a practical sense than I personally do from Plato. But could there be an Aristotle without a Plato? That I don't know.
That's good. Yeah, good. Real good answer. Another thing that I learned about from Father Ripperger, speaks about philosophy, speaks about psychology. He talks about a concept called the principle of the integral good. And if a thing is not, and I struggled how to make sense of this psychology, I think of Albert Ellis. Don't rate people, rate actions, right? It's not ours to judge. Christ said, don't judge, right? Not that we're judging people, but when judging, Father Ripperger says, if we're looking at music or if we're looking at a movie, it has to be good in all of its parts. If there's one element of, taking the Lord's name in vain, something that's immoral, he said, Aquinas would say it renders the entire thing bad, right? If we deny one teaching of the Catholic faith, one dogma, Aquinas would say the virtue of faith corrupts, right? So I think that's what he's kind of talking about with the principle of the integral good. So I guess, how do I make sense of that as a Catholic psychology guy? I guess maybe relating it to one thing to things and another to people, not looking at, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a tough question with some different aspects there. Because yes, we just want to judge particular actions. We may
right.
Vehemently disagree with and dislike and find it's very harmful what a particular person has done, either to themselves or to others. And if we're concerned about their harmful action to themselves, it could be our virtue of charity because we care for their salvation. And if we're worried about what their action, how it negatively impacts other people or sets a bad example, it ties into justice. We want everyone to get their rightful due there. So yeah, I think too, and when you get the mixed products, like talking about with music, I've always felt that strongly. I love multiple forms of music. I mean, classical and rock and other varieties also. But in our modern music, yeah, the vulgarity, or if there's evil sentiments in there, even though the sound might be nice, I'm very hesitant to endorse or recommend people listen to things like that. Now, when it comes to written materials, like the ideas of philosophers and so forth, it's an interesting distinction there. Like sometimes I will read the works of atheists, but even there, though, but with a careful eye at separating the wheat from the chaff. There's in his Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason encyclical, St. Pope John Paul II said that, even within the writings of people who try to spread faith and reason further apart, he said there might be some seminal ideas, some small truths there that are worth thinking about and harvesting. So in that sense, I try to be willing to read contrary viewpoints that might be contrary to the church, but there I would never want to actually embrace the parts that are contrary or endorse those parts to other people. And if I would endorse certain elements of that person's thinking, I want to make it clear to others I'm not endorsing their whole outset. Like for Ellis, at times I borrow from him, and if I do it in writing, I try to make clear what this man's background was and what in his work I find useful and where I believe it will take you off course.
Okay. So would Aquinas, now is that called the principle of the integral good? Is that called the pseudo-Dionysian? Am I on the right track with that? I think I've heard something like that before.
Now, there's plenty of pseudo-Dionysius in Aquinas, but that particular point, I'm not sure. I can't tell you. I'm not certain about that. But yeah, with the integral good too, and I might be off topic here too, but I'm thinking though, one of the characteristics of Thomas Aquinas was that he was sometimes criticized for his using pagan sources, because some people, kind of a phrase he used earlier, said no, he's watering down the wine of Christ with this pagan thought. And he said, no, by Christianizing it, he's turning that water into wine, by baptizing it through Christian thought. So there, I guess the main idea is, I'm not sure if I'm missing the point on this concept of integralism. I'd have to research, but yeah, I would want to say, yeah, we can pick and choose particular behaviors, particular actions, particular writings, and endorse what's true and charitable and good in it, but reject what is bad and be careful. And if we are using other sources, be very careful that we're not spreading what's bad. Also, I know this is kind of a related concept, and the exact term is missing for me now. There is the idea within the Catholic Church and within some philosophers that also that certain acts are not just bad in certain circumstances; they are by their nature bad. Right. And you find this, for example, adultery. It's taught by the Catholic Church. You will also find Aristotle and Epictetus, other Musonius Rufus, other Stoics saying this. They're saying certain things like if you're if you're angry in the right measure, at the right time, for the right reasons, like not to harm a person, but maybe to correct them. There are times when anger could be appropriate, but some things, like an act of adultery, never is. There's just simply no right way to do it.
Excellent. Another thing I think about was, it was almost like Aquinas was kind of in dialogue in a certain sense. I think Bishop Barron says something like that. Aquinas in dialogue with Aristotle and the Stoics, right? And that was kind of his thing. So then he explained also that Vatican II, there was these transcendental Thomists, which I'm not even sure that you could consider them Thomists. I don't know if you'd have a take on that, but almost like the Catholic Church in dialogue with Lonergan, maybe Lonergan being in dialogue with Hume and Kant. Are those philosophers completely irreconcilable with Thomism and scholastic thinking, or can they be reconciled, and if so, how?
Well, that's a good question, and I can't speak with great authority here, but I think in terms of Hume, when he questions causality itself, and Kant when he questions reason itself as a true guide to an objective reality, those are pretty fundamental differences in my book. Right. One of the best Catholic writers who's addressed some of this, in my opinion, is philosopher Edward Feser. Yep. In his books like Aquinas for Beginners, I think it is, and some of his other books. I think so I would consider myself more of a traditional Thomist, what they might call the strict observance. People like Father Garrigou Lagrange is one of the Thomists in the 20th century who while I would think as a Thomist, you're going to have some willingness to read other perspectives, to consider them, but you're not going to try to make things mesh because Thomas, like Aristotle, he's also had an eye open for logical contradictions. And, a thing cannot be both what it is and what it's not at the same way at the same time. So I think part of Thomism is, too, that we have a logical coherence and we have an open eye for contradictory ideas.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I know how important Aquinas is and scholasticism. I believe it was officially declared by one of the popes that this is the lens through which to view the Catholic faith. So one Pope Pius is maybe the 11th or the 9th, something like that. And and unfortunately, we've seen a lot of Thomism and scholastic. It seems like anytime there's an error, people are trying to an error in thinking. They're trying to get rid of the scholastics. Luther's dissertation was against Thomism.
Yeah.
And then even as time went on, it seemed like a lot of the Vatican II councilmen there were again opposed to Thomism, maybe looking at it, maybe accusing it of being either too rigid or ahistorical. In other words, not dealing with things, being too theoretical, not dealing with the world as it is. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yes. It's interesting when I came back to the church and was reading Thomas, the Summa Theologica. It's opened with an encyclical from Pope Leo the 13th in 1879, Aeterni Patris, on the Eternal Fathers. And so he's writing in 1879. We've gone through the Enlightenment and people like Voltaire and those atheists. Darwin's books are out now, and evolution is big time in the air. And Pope Leo has a statement in there. He says that people who have said they will devote themselves only to reason, they will only follow reason as their guide. He said they're going to be brought back to the church by the stirrings of the Holy Spirit and the writings of the church fathers and the scholastics, and foremost of all, St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
And when I read that, I realized, boy, he wrote that in 1879. In 2004, that exact thing happened to me. I think Thomas should have an appeal to people who want to follow reason. Today we call it science. People say, "Oh, I'm for science." If you're for science, read St. Thomas Aquinas, because the virtue of science or knowledge, from Latin scio, to know, does involve cause and effect relationships and having a real grasp of those. But it goes beyond that. It goes to virtues of understanding, where we understand underlying principles, and wisdom, where we focus on the highest things, the highest of causes and effects, which is God. So I think we definitely reject Thomism at our peril. The last book I had out is called 12 Life Lessons from St. Thomas Aquinas. Timeless spiritual wisdom for our turbulent times. And that's where I lay out my own case, how we err if we reject these fundamental truths for Thomas. Because, there more popes than any other have called Thomas, the common doctor of the church, the one that we can all hold in common. And it's not saying, oh, he was so much greater than St. Augustine or St. John Chrysostom. It was said that he was so great because he loved the church fathers who came before him so much and understood them and absorbed them so well. It's like he inherited the intellects of all of them. So if you read St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, you're getting the synthesis of virtually everyone who came before him. It's not just Thomas making this up out of his head. He's borrowing. He dialogues with Aristotle, but he actually quotes St. Augustine more than he does Aristotle in the Summa Theologica. So the best of pagan philosophy, the best of Catholic tradition. He even quotes Jewish philosophers, Maimonides, some Muslim thinkers, Avicenna, Averroes. So to read Thomas, you're getting the best of what came before him, and I think you're getting a very, very solid grounding for what comes after him. Not to say every answer to every question of the world is in the Summa Theologica, but a surprising number are. But the kind of issues we face today, there's a very good chance you're going to find principles there in that Summa that are going to guide us today. And as you said, Martin Luther, very much opposed Thomas. So he's also been used by some of the new atheists. Luther made some statements, very much denigrating reason, calling reason a whore, saying it's always opposed to faith. And Thomas showed us that idea how faith never contradicts reason, because they're both about truth. Faith just reaches some areas that are beyond the grasp of our reason, but it never contradicts it. Or as Pope, John Paul II said, they're the two wings with which we fly to truth.
Right. Supra-rational rather than infra-rational.
Yes, exactly.
Right. No, that's excellent. And it seems like a lot of the people, maybe more, I guess, next generation, maybe Vatican II apologists, you would call them. I don't know. It's like, well, we wanted to go back to the fathers, and even with like the new mass, like, well, we wanted to go back to the fathers and skipping over the tradition. And I believe, I'm not sure it's the formal name of the heresy, but it's either called archaeologism or antiquarianism, where you skip over the scholastics, and they forget that Thomas and the scholastics hashed out all of the teachings of the fathers, almost as if St. Thomas Aquinas ignored the fathers. Nothing could be further from the truth. He synthesized all that together into a cohesive, unifying whole.
Oh, absolutely. And in some of his lesser known works, like his commentary on the Gospel of St. John, just pick that up and you see how he spends pages on a single verse. And it's not just, here's what I think this means. It's Jerome said this, Augustine said this, Chrysostom said that, pointing out the different spiritual highlights, how multiple meanings can come from each verse. So yes, when you read Thomas, you are getting the church fathers, east and west, literally dozens of them. He wrote these books too called the Catena Aureas, or these golden chains, where Thomas, he's not giving you his own opinion. He's giving you on each verse of the Gospels strings of commentary from the church fathers who came before him. So yeah, if you're into the church fathers, yeah, read them firsthand, no doubt, but also find out what Thomas did with them, how he respected them so much, and how he made these great syntheses of insights from different fathers who lived thousands of miles apart and centuries apart from one another. So yeah, if you want to cherish what's there in the past, it would be very unwise to overlook what the medievals did in the scholastic period.
Right, when at the Council of Trent, they had two books in the front, right? One was the Holy Bible, and the other one was the Summa.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at our catechism today, it's rife with full of references to the Summa.
Do you think it's a valid critique people have saying that Thomism being too ahistorical, not really practically dealing too theoretically, not dealing with the real world? How do you respond to that?
No, I disagree. I actually think
I would say,
yeah, it's the most practical philosophy and theology that I've come across. When I read the second part of the second part, like I did in the last book, the 12 Life Lessons, you can look at some of these controversial things that are going on today, like that infamous incident a year or so back now where the young protesters are at the pro-life rally, and the guys from, was it Kentucky? And, they're accused of harassing this man, and everyone, jumps on them, the media and so forth. Later, you get a bigger video clip and realize there was more to this story. Well, in Thomas, he talks about what's involved in casting a judgment if you don't have all the facts. And he lays out these different steps, how this can be a venial sin. Well, how we all have human tendencies where we may judge another person, and that may or not be sinful, or we're suspicious of a person. He goes step by step. Then saying how if you actually cast a judgment on this person without sufficient evidence, it can be a mortal sin to do that. So we can look at incidents today and see Thomas giving us guidance 700 years ago, because people were people back then too, Right. So it's still relevant. We look at things I think of like politicians lining up for communion, and Thomas addresses, whether or not should sinners be given the Holy Eucharist. And he cites Augustine, and he says, well, if sinners could not be given the Eucharist, then none of us would get the Eucharist, right? Because at some point or another, we're all sinners. Though ideally, we're going to go to confession and be clear of mortal sins when we receive. But then he breaks it down to saying the difference between being a private sinner and a public sinner. A person who sins publicly, leading others towards sins against the doctrine of the faith, he's saying they should not be admitted to communion. Many modern priests and bishops, some would agree, some would disagree, but that opinion is there in Thomas. And I found very few, I can't even think of any cases where when he's addressing a philosophical or theological issue where I would disagree with his conclusion.
Yeah, makes sense. Favorite argument for the existence of God from Aquinas. I love that chart. Absolutely love the chart that you laid out in this book here about talking about going from the the four causes, and then juxtaposing that with the arguments for the existence of God. Excellent chart. What's your favorite?
Thanks.
What do you think is the most practical?
Yeah, and I will say that chart, I gave the reference. I have many, many books next to me here on Thomas Aquinas, dozens of them. And it was a previous thinker who related it to the four causes. I believe it was a priest. I cited him in there. But I love it. I love putting things in a chart, the little star diagram. What's my favorite? They're all so good. But okay, let me just give you my favorite underlying principle and then my favorite argument.
Okay.
One of my favorite underlying principles of Thomas's 5 proofs that are given there so briefly right at the start of the Summa is that, some people, said, well, God created the world. And then some people said there was an ancient belief, like among the ancient Greeks, there's no, the universe was always here. And we see that now in some modern atheists, like the objectivists say, existence exists. That's your starting ground. It's always just out there, right? But Thomas designed those arguments so they apply even if we hold that the universe was always there also with God. In other words, he's not saying this is based on going back in time and finding God. He's saying all 5 of these proofs are valid even if there was always a universe. God just didn't have to make it. He has to be there right now for things to work the way they do, to have causes and effects, for things to move and change. God has to be there right now underlying all this. So I love that, the way Thomas laid that out, that even if you believe the universe is always there, well, that doesn't disprove Thomas, because all of his arguments are set up even if you assume that premise. Now, Thomas said, of course, that we know from Revelation that God did create it, did have a starting point. And of course, the things like the Big Bang Theory, partly with the Catholic priests having a major involvement there, have given us scientific, evidence for that creation. But they even work without that. But anyway, the number one is probably the number 3, the one about the argument of necessary versus contingent existence. Because, again, that was one of the arguments that drew me away from the faith. There were some others. But this idea that, no, the existence, that's the starting ground. You just open your eyes, the world's out there. You don't have to say who made it. It just is. It's just there, But Thomas points out, basically that anything that's there, well, nothing gave itself its own existence. You and I didn't. So many decades back, neither of us existed whatsoever. There's nothing we can look out there and see right now that was always there or always necessarily will be in the future. But then he argues how, though, so at some point there, if there's ever nothing, there can never be something. And he's showing there has to be something that of necessity must exist. It can't just not exist or not exist. It has to. It's necessary existence, not just contingent. And from that flows all other manner of existence. So it's the source and font of everything that exists, or as Thomas also puts in philosophical terms, something that its essence and its existence are one. That for it to be and what it is are merged. Its very nature is to exist, which is not the case, for anything else in the universe. So he goes through a logical chain there, in a beautiful way, explaining that idea. But then I love how he starts that one, though, or he starts the whole 5 arguments, maybe. He starts with a quote from Scripture. We can go through great logical chains to this idea that God is self-sustaining existence, But he says, well, look at the book of Exodus. And when Moses asked God in the burning bush, what's your name? Who should I say sent me? And God just answers, I am, Yahweh. He said, say, he who is sent you. So there we have the supposedly primitive desert people. They're giving us the nature of God is that necessary being and just a I am. That simple 2 little words sums up this huge philosophical logical chain. So that's one of my favorites from Thomas. He's also showing again there how faith and reason go together, how we can use reason to find what they call the God of philosophers to show that God must exist. But then he's also tying it, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also to Jesus Christ, of course, who also tells us, at one point he says that I am, and before Abraham was, I am. So we have this great connecting chain there between what we can obtain from reason and from faith. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm going on, but one other thing I love about his arguments is they all start with the simple evidence of our senses. Open your eyes, there's a world out there. Things change, things move, and so on. That's our starting point, and we reason from there back to God.
And I believe that's called an a posteriori, right? There's a priori and a posteriori. Is that the word?
That's right. Yes, a posteriori means that we're starting with the facts and then moving up to the causes. Starting with the effects, moving to the causes. And St. Paul writes about this in Romans, the 1st chapter, talking about some of the pagan people saying that, from the things in the universe, they could reason back and know that there was a God. In the book of Wisdom, it says, the beauty of the world reflects its creator. So yes, that idea that just starting with the bare bone evidence of our senses, that plus logical reasoning is what leads us to know that God must exist.
Excellent. And yeah, I'm looking at your chart again, and it's even better than I remembered. It's the four causes lined up with St. Thomas's five ways, lined up with five primal entitative attributes of God. That's great. Page 156, 157. Just great stuff.
Freshen up on that one.
Yeah, no, this is excellent. Yep, 156, 157.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that one of my main sources was Aidan Nichols, great Dominican. His book, Discovering Aquinas, were some of these ideas that I pulled from here to line these up together. Yeah, and the primal attributes. Now, that's another one. After Thomas gives these five proofs, which are very, very short, just a page or two in the Summa, he goes greatly into the attributes of God, like what it means that he's simple, that he's perfect, that he's infinite, that he's immutable, that his unity. And it's actually in one of those attributes that he answered one of the other objections of the atheists that pulled me away, because some of them say the idea of God is self-contradictory. Because how could God be both all-knowing, omniscient, and all-powerful or omnipotent, right? Because if he knows what he's going to do tomorrow, then he doesn't have to do the power to do something different, right? So they're saying you couldn't be both all-powerful and all-knowing. It's self-contradictory statement. Even like Dawkins in his God delusion uses that old one, But I found that Thomas had answered that remarkably well, in the 13th century when he talks about the eternity of God. If we think of God as just a bigger version of us, then yeah, God wakes up today and he's got tomorrow, he's got yesterday behind us. But Thomas explains, the eternity of God, how he lives in the eternal now. He's fully actualized, full act at all time. He's not partly here today, needs to be something different and bigger tomorrow. He's all there all the time, eternally. So for him, it's not a contradiction. He doesn't have a yesterday, today, and tomorrow like we do. It is all eternally present for him. And then he gives a very simple little analogy to try to draw us up toward this idea. And it basically says, imagine you're walking towards some town on a hilly road. As you go along that road, you're not going to see maybe the end destination until you reach the last hill. And you're not going to know everybody on the route before you and after you if there's these hills in the way, right? He said that's our perspective as we are here on earth, with what's behind us and what's before us in time and in space. But he says, but God has the perspective of a person on high, who sees, both the destination and everyone on the road all at once and instantly. So to me, that was one of my favorite of Thomas's descriptions of God's attributes and how it answers some of the arguments of the atheists that I came across.
Excellent. Now, I went to a presentation at NYU several years ago. I think it was about 5 years ago. Dominicans bringing up a proposition of Thomistic evolution, like a theistic evolution whole thing. And they were proposing this whole thing, how it could be congruent with the teachings of Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic Church. As time went on, reading other information on YouTube, different things. Now I'm more leaning against evolution. So in school, you're believing evolution. Growing up starts off creation. Then school, now you become an evolutionist. Then learning more about the faith, then it's against it. And now these Thomists are saying, well, it's possible for it to be reconciled with Thomas. And their whole thing is Thomistic evolution. They have a website. I got the book. I read it. I would think now that Aquinas would really lean against that. And he would actually probably be more of a young earth creationist. I don't know. What's your thoughts?
Well, I'll tell you, I know that's a good question. I've not read it recently, but I read some things on both sides of this from Thomas on both sides of the issue there. And I must say that I haven't reasoned this through to the end there. I know part of the idea is that they're saying, well, don't limit God. He could have created a world that was designed to unfold.
Right.
But this may go contrary to some of the scholastic, philosophical conceptions. So I say I personally, I can't say for certain myself, but in terms of the secular evolution, I remember when I was coming back to the church, it was actually one of the books that helped bring me back. There is a book by Mortimer Adler called The Difference of Man and the Difference It Makes, and where he talks about every species on Earth has quantitative differences, little small changes and advances in abilities and so forth. But he was arguing that the human being is qualitatively different, not on the same continuum of any other species on Earth. As Thomas said, what defines human beings is our power of intellect or understanding, that we can think on a conceptual level, form language, and so forth, and no other animal whatsoever can. So to me, there is a profound profound jump between the highest of all species and the least of us human beings. And sometimes I'll joke and say, well, if you disagree with that, then go consult the academic libraries of the chimpanzees and dolphins and come back and let me know their take on the matter, you know. But for me, I can't give it a definitive point here, but I will say that to me there is just a vast qualitative difference between human beings and animals that I find hard to believe that natural processes based on matter could lead to that difference.
Yeah, it just seems like it's almost now going back to what I knew as a kid, as opposed to school. If you didn't believe in the Big Bang, evolution, and heliocentric, well, it's not even heliocentricity, it's acentricity, that there is no center of the universe, right? Like, I guess Einstein's theory taken to its logical conclusion, there is no center of the universe. So now I find myself being more along the lines of young Earth creationist, geocentrist, whereas maybe in school you couldn't even consider that, because then now you'd be totally nuts. And it just seems like the church fathers were unanimous on those points.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, you know, when we try to synthesize the findings of modern science, you know, with the teachings of the faith. We have to be very, very careful, because our evidence is always partial and speculative, especially when we're reaching out, you know, vast periods of time, perhaps in the past, or to the vast stretches of space. I say, you know, we have to be careful in these issues. If the church hasn't defined something, you know, realizing we may not have the full story, we may not have a full understanding. So we may, you know, maybe have awe and wonder at the universe God's created, but there could be certain issues that at this point in time we can't be certain that we really know the ultimate answers.
Yeah, and add another red pill to the mix of what I've learned. It seems like Aquinas was more in favor of the monarchies than a republic in terms of a government.
Yes, and I think there too, you know, he borrows from Aristotle in those same books where Aristotle talks about friendship, and other places too. You know, he talks about monarchies and you know, the lead by one person, or oligarchies by a small group, and then democracies. And in Aristotle, he considered the monarchy the best because everything would be cohesive if you had the right person there. But he said then they have their degenerative forms, where a monarchy can become a tyranny, and an oligarchy can become what was the word? What word did he use? I don't recall right now. But kind of, you know, a rule by elitists, or, you know, kind of a mob. Oh yeah, then democracy could kind of become mob rule. So yeah, according to Thomas, and again, I think he might be borrowing on some of the philosophical tradition from people like Plato, the idea of this philosopher king, which has been so rare, you know, in our time, but we have had some great leaders, King St. Louis of France, and the secular world, the Roman Marcus Aurelius. But yeah, Thomas has some really in-depth writings on politics that are worth looking at. And ideally, I think, though, he would be thinking in terms of monarchy, and in terms of the ultimate would be, you know, Christ as the king, you know,
Excellent.
Of heaven and on earth. So, and I will say there too, sorry, I'm going to digress a little bit.
No, it's
but
great.
We have so much going on in our world today about politics, different political systems and all. And one of the things I wrote about in my last book was Thomas Aquinas talking about like 8 different varieties of what justice means. And this brings us back to practicality too. When he talks about the commutative justice, distributive justice, like governments at a very broad level, what you're distributing out to different people, versus commutative justice, or one-on-one interactions. I think, you know, our fundamental there is this one-on-one interaction. And even in the Catechism, it tells us there is no distributive justice, which is closer to the idea of social justice, without this one-on-one justice, where we're each just to each other. So I think this is another place where so many of the insights of Thomas are valuable, because, yeah, though while he can look at broad things like political systems, he's constantly reminding us that regardless of our system, what's the most important is how do we treat each other, the people within our own particular sphere.
Excellent. Excellent. I have one more for you that I wanted to ask. Do you have any books about natural law with Aquinas? And if not, can you write one for me?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's let me think. It's not something I'd say in great detail, because I'm usually focused in on his virtue ethics. You know, I think to me, it's someone has a greater intersection with my background in psychology in philosophy, where the natural law probably has closer ties, if people are going to specialize, to people in law, in legal theory. So off the top of my head, most of my many books on Thomas, address in some manner his writings on natural law. But I guess one place might be just within his Summa itself, to start there with Thomas. Because if you get a sense for Thomas, if you have some familiarity with him, he is pretty understandable to dip in there and read him himself. But I'm sorry, I can't be real helpful on the law aspect. As far as me writing one, that's something to think about in the future.
I figured I'd plant the seeds. What the heck? Oh, so much great information, and I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. And we didn't even hit on weightlifting or exercise. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about that? What got you into exercise? How do you feel like that's fortified you, like helped you in spiritually and mentally? Talk about that a little bit before we close it down.
Sure, I'll do the story of it very in brief. The person who got me into it was Superman. When I was 5 years old, I saw him on TV and said, that's what I want to be, this big, strong guy, but he's using it for truth, justice, and the American way, right? Well, a few years later, I realized I couldn't be Superman, but I saw a weightlifter on TV. I think I was just in second grade. I was thinking it might have been like one of the Olympics in 1968 or something, like Mexico City maybe. But I thought, now that's a real human being. I could do that. So I kind of insisted that my dad buy me a little weight set. So I've had one since the second grade. I've trained regularly since the seventh grade. So I've been working out for really more than 45 years now, I think. And in my teens, I worked as a fitness instructor, kind of before we had personal trainers. A lot of the hardcore gyms had instructors who were always there on the floor to help anybody and write up programs the whole bit. So I did that, met my wife, met some of my best friends there doing that. In my early teens, I competed in a little bit of bodybuilding, Teenage Mr. Illinois contest. In my early 20s, several powerlifting contests. Through the years, I did stuff like 10-man tug of war teams, which is a lot of fun. Highland Games, tossing of the caber and that kind of stuff. But all through my life, I've enjoyed lifting. The main system I've used is something called HIIT, or high intensity training, where you're kind of getting your biggest bang for your buck. I warm up. I usually just do one at most two hard sets, and I kind of move on. Well, I'm 59 now, and it's still very meaningful to me. I still very, very much enjoy it. So one of the things I'm trying to do now is much of the research on healthy aging, talk about these biomarkers. How can we gauge if a person's going to age well and be functional? The top two, over your aerobic capacity, your cholesterol, muscle mass, and muscle strength, So I'm really trying to see what I can do as I get older to try to maintain that for myself and to help plant that message to other people that the strength training is very important. It's not just for young people. It's even more important, done in a safe manner for old people. So I'm just excited. I'm 59 now. I have a few goals to reach before age 60 that in some things will approximate, what I've not been able to do since my 30s. So kind of having the time now that I'm retired, I like that. But I wrote a book called Fit for Eternal Life. But here's where I tried to show the Catholic perspective on the proper care of our body. It's a temple of the Holy Spirit. We've had major popes, Pope Pius XII, Pope John Paul II would speak to groups of athletes, and some of their talks have been written down, and have just gems for us on how it is a good thing for proper care of our body. And when I wrote the book Fit for Eternal Life, I also tried to show how it tied into the virtues. The two clearest are, fortitude is your ability to do hard things and to endure what's hard. Well, that applies to strength training, to lifting big weights, to endurance training, to enduring discomfort. And then temperance is like a moderation or self-control. That has a pretty direct application to how we eat.
Excellent. Great stuff. I got to get that book. That's phenomenal. And you have some of the information that the Pope spoke, those letters in there?
Yes, I give quotes and excerpts. And I will say there was a man named Robert Feeney that wrote a book called The Catholic Perspective, I think, on sport and exercise in the 1990s. And that was my main source for those. He had the full excerpts there. But yeah, I excerpt some of the highlights. And one of the most important ones is a quote from Pope Pius XII, where he says, the church wholly approves of physical culture, care of the body, if it's kept in proper proportion. Then he specifies what he means by that, so it doesn't overtake certain parts of your life. So I'll shut up for a second, but I do want to say too, Gene, that also we didn't talk about your wrestling, and I find that very fascinating. So hopefully either now or at some point.
No, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk about it. So my brothers, me and both my younger brothers, we wrestled from elementary school right through college. I wrestled at Rutgers for 3 years, wrestled at the University of Pennsylvania for my last 2 years. Jeff was at Penn all 5 years because we have a redshirt year. And our brother Greg, the seminarian, the youngest one, he wrestled at Rutgers all 5 years. And he was actually the best out of the three of us, ranked as high as sixth in the country. We were all ranked in the top 20 in the country in college Division I. And Greg actually was studying. So at Rutgers, they wrestled at the Rutgers Athletic Center. And then when he went to the seminary, Immaculate Conception in the Archdiocese of Newark, then the Bishop Cecchio, used to be the rector at the Pontifical University at the Angelicum. So he actually went from the rack to the knack in Rome. So he was studying in Rome. They sent him back during the whole COVID thing. But if you could believe this, he was actually studying. It's his 5th year in the seminary. He's going to be being ordained a deacon this July. But he was working out with the Italian Olympic wrestling team, training with the number 3 guy in the world, 1 day a week while he was studying at the NAC. So he would study and he would train with the Italian wrestler.
Well, I love that. That's amazing. The times of that must have been spectacular. I will say that as a young kid, I was a big fan of all-star wrestling. You know, it would be the WWE type thing now.
Me too.
Never did the, I won't say real wrestling, never did the kind of wrestling he did, but always very much respected it. To me, it appears to be kind of a mental and physical chess, there's a strategy. And of course, it requires, the strength and dexterity. And I think weightlifters and wrestlers have a very common ground there in our legendary father weightlifting, Milo of Crotona, as a young man, he lifts that calf. The calf gets bigger. He keeps lifting it till he becomes this massively powerful man. And for decades, the undefeated original Olympics wrestling champion. Right.
That's, I guess, the beginning of periodization training right there.
There you go. Yeah. Progressive resistance, and boom.
You're right about how there is that parallel, because when you're talking about the body and powerlifting or bodybuilding, it's what you eat, it's your sleep, it's your exercise, like it all ties in. And with a sport like wrestling, you have to make weight, you have to be strong, you have to be in great shape, and you need to have great technique. So there's so many, it's an all-encompassing thing, which is, I think, why a lot of wrestlers, faith is a common thing among high-level wrestlers. I don't know, maybe if we went into other sports, they wouldn't be speaking as much about the faith, but Christianity, or I guess you could just say Christianity, because unfortunately it's more FCA, AIA, in other words, these non-denominational evangelical groups, they're the ones who are kind of operating the space. So I've actually started, my brother, and several other wrestler friends have started a Catholic wrestlers group that we're trying to spread the Catholic faith more inside the wrestling community, because still it's, unfortunately, if you're Catholic, well, we don't go by the Pope, and we don't think Mary was always a virgin and all this kind of stuff when you go to their groups. So I think it's very important that we, point them to the fullness, like Matthew 28, teach all that I've taught you.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Such a good thing you're doing there, Gene, because the same thing when I was writing about, fitness and strength training. Well, what does the Catholic Church have to do with that? Well, almost no matter what you're interested in, if it's a good thing, the Catholic Church does have something to say about that, because right. We always know that we're ensouled, bodies, and the body's important. God made us good, and we'll have resurrected, glorified bodies someday. So excellent.
So what does Aquinas say? Are we gonna be ripped? Are we gonna be in our prime when we're in heaven? Or are we going to be whatever body we die with? Does he say anything about that?
Yeah, sure he does. He talks about different qualities. One is agility. Like now it's hard for us. Like we've got to train to do an event. To develop skills. He says in heaven, our glorified bodies, they will instantly obey us. And right. He talks about
agility. The way I remember my mnemonic device, and I see how to memorize things. So I kind of do this too. I haven't read your book on that. So my mnemonic for the resurrected body is bias. BIAS. So brightness, impassibility, agility, and subtlety.
Yes. And that brightness, sometimes he talks about as clarity, but yes, that's right. Yeah. So the thing is, we're going to have these wonderful bodies at the resurrection. I even I'm actually have a book coming out this fall, Thomas Aquinas on the Four Last Things. and I address what he talks about the glorified body in a few of those chapters. So yeah, so I have one, I said, will we be faster than the flash in our glorified bodies? And he addresses things like, well, we move instantaneously. And, just boom, you're just right there, without any period of time. And I think he comes down to saying, well, it may not be instantaneous, but it'll be so fast you may not be able to perceive it, And another one is like, will we be like the invisible man? Will there be a certain translucence to our body? So anyway, he writes wonderfully about what we can, the hints that we're given in Scripture and the church fathers about what our bodies will be like. But it's really, really magnificent. And I really love it, too, because it underscores that Catholic teaching. Yes, we're spiritual beings. We have a soul, but we also have a body, and that body is important. God crafted us to have a body, and we're going to have a body throughout eternity after the resurrection. So just a very, very beautiful thing and an awesome thing to think about. So yeah, I think we will be ripped. And Thomas speculates that we will all come back. Probably, I'm not sure how old you are, but
35.
30. Well, he's predicting that we'll come back around 33, somewhere in the early 30s, where some people have said tends to be the athletic peak and prime. And I remember when I was reading this in Thomas, I did a little Google search within the last year, and some of those athletic measures for strength and endurance, the early 30s, very often is where people are peaking. So he thinks we're going to come back in our peak condition.
Well, because I think now my early 30s, okay, yeah, for strength, I would say that was probably my peak. But then when I think about being in shape, I mean, it's just like a open shut case that it was back when I was wrestling.
Yeah, and that can vary, through lifetime too. I can think of for myself. I mean, my goal here soon is to be stronger than I was in my 30s, but in my 30s I had some different goals. I was doing distance running and other things, and that's another glorious thing about our bodies too. As we get older, our goals, might change and they might shift towards one direction at one period of life, and you might find yourself reverting back to an older goal later on. It's just amazing the plasticity that God has built into our bodies. At some point I know I'm going to reach a point of diminishing returns, but I'm approaching 60 and it hasn't happened yet. So thank God for that.
So do I get back? Maybe such a vain question. Do I get back the strong body or the fit body? Because looking great, three different things. Putting up the most weight was one body that I had. Not that it was like that much variation, but that was one body. Then being the most, if you want to call it ripped, that was a different body. And then actually being able to do the most physical work was a different body that probably looked the worst. Would Aquinas say which one of those I get back, or just don't waste your time thinking about stupid things? It's all straw.
That's a great question. Well, I would say it's possible in the glorified body. It will be possible to have the 3-in-1 package, the total package, with their alta peak. I don't know. I'm not sure what Thomas would say. But I say, even from an earthly perspective, depending on our goals, we might want to go for that happy medium where none of them is 100%, but each of those three is as close as you can get while maintaining decent levels of the other.
That's what I think too. Unbelievable. Yeah, I have the Superman complex as well. The book, a Catholic perspective on physical exercise and sports. Is that it by Feeney?
Yeah, that was one of the best resources I had when I wrote Fit for Eternal Life. Just a small book, but has good insights, especially those talks from the popes.
Excellent. Great. And I'll get your book too. Okay. Where do people find more information from you? Website, social media pages? How do they get you to speak? How do they buy your books? Where do you send them?
Sure. Well, I've had multiple Catholic publishers. The main one is Sophia Institute. So they have sophiainstitute.com, has about 10 of my books, I think, and 11 coming, or it's 9 there and 10 coming. The major booksellers have, on the internet have all of them. I think I've got 20 Catholic books out now, or this will be the 20, something like that. Well, my own website's drvost.com, just drvost.com. I don't sell books there, but I have some background information. And if people want to contact me, there's a little comment box on the bottom. So I'll respond to that. And as far as social media, about the only thing I do really is the main thing is Facebook. So people want to connect there, they're happy to send me something. That'd be fun.
Excellent. I guess that's another thing. Well, I guess we could talk about that another time. I self-published a book, My Spiritual Strength, Building the Total Athlete for Christ. But I'd like to get that picked up by a bigger publishing. I guess we talk about that off the air, but.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Very happy to.
Absolutely. Dr. Kevin Vost, thank you very much for everything. Unbelievable. Like, this could have literally went on for another 3 hours in my mind. So I appreciate it. I'd love to have you back another time. Thank you for everything.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed it. Thanks for the invitation. I'll be happy to talk to you again sometime, Gene.
Absolutely. God bless you. God bless your family.
You too.